I'm gonna get started regardless. So basically, this whole presentation started with the idea of what am I doing this time of year, which personally with bonsai is letting the stuff outside continue to stay dormant. I do some on my tropicals, but this is a lot of times kind of my planning time of year. So I'm reviewing parameters that I have for my own bonsai. Any of you who know my story, who've known me in the society, I started by falling in love with bonsai and then decided to become a student and go back to school. So I've moved 6 different times in that process, lived in six different locations, learned a lot along the way. Thought it would be great to pass along to you some of the tips and tricks that I've gained, as well as kind of situations I ran into in different cities. So intro slide, we can move to the next one, Andy. Sweet. I said, well, why don't I build some shelves? It's south facing, it'd be the perfect place to put all my trees. It's beautiful to look at. Managing it was not fun. If you look in the, so it's the right-hand photo where you can see the stair rail, you can see a little step ladder sticking up. That would go on the landing of the stairs and I'd be up and down. Became almost a full day operation on the weekends to water trees, take them to the kitchen sink, water a bunch of them and drain them and back and forth. So a testament to being committed to my trees, but not an easy way to manage them. This is in that process of like how much water do my trees need, learning that watering cycle. And I will say, I think right when these photos were taken, when I was transitioning from using kind of a bonsai soil with potting mix in it to just a bonsai soil, very free draining and open draining. But what I learned is the chopstick method. Are you guys here, I know a lot of you are all of you familiar? It gets to the crux of this method, but any questions on this setup or anything we've covered before we move on? Okay, I'll get you guys talking eventually. We're ready for the next one. So those stacked greenhouse windows just weren't enough. The bug had bitten and I needed more trees. And kind of early on, my mantra was, if I've done everything I can do to a tree, but I still want to do stuff, well, I must need another tree. So you start filling up more and more space. So that was kind of where I started to expand with grow lights. This is a metal halide lamp, 500 watts. I keyed into that because that's what Jerry Meislich uses. He's the bonsai hunk. Exotic Ficus, the Exotic Bonsai is his book. He's got a new publication out as well, very good info. And he has great success with metal halide lamps. I believe he uses 1,000-watt lamps. The difference, some of the differences being, I think he uses a different spectrum of bulb. I think he uses just more of a general full spectrum. This was heavily weighted to the blue spectrum. And I will say the walls were kind of a pale green, so it's not that far, but it's a really sickly colored light. This wasn't a bad photo. That's actually kind of the light color. They used metal halide lamps for a while at gas stations because it makes acne really stick out. And they did it to prevent teenagers from hanging around in front of gas stations. So this isn't a room you want to sit in all the time. More of those details, but first let's get further into some of the details of grow lights and their similarities and differences, or pros and cons. Already spoken to a little bit of this. Fluorescent, they are by nature low wattage, which is great because you don't have to use a lot of watts and you can light up your room. Now the downside is, really when it comes to growing plants, if it's done properly, your wattage is going to equal your success at the end when you come to the plant available to lights. With that said, they do work. You just have to keep them very close to your trees. And personally, I like to say Shohin size or smaller, which is kind of 8 to 10 inch size or smaller. Beyond that, the light won't get to that lower canopy. So you can get branches start to get weak. It still works. But for me, by the end of winter, the canopy is as happy as could be, and I'm worried that my bottom branches are gonna drop off the tree. Now, they're safe. I put a question mark there because they're not gonna start a fire in your house. It's not that kind of risk. However, the fluorescent tubes, as many of you know, do have heavy metals, mercury being the most common. So there is still a hazard in your home, so you're aware. to properly recycle the bulbs is $1 a foot, so it is another cost put into your fluorescent lighting. But I still use a lot of it because I have them and it does work. The ballast life, typically with fluorescent fixtures I've had, the ballast lasts 1.5 to 5 years. So you're putting in that typically $150, maybe $200 cost. You're buying bulb, you're recycling bulbs, and in 1.5 to 5 years, you're gonna start all over with purchasing a new ballast, most likely. I already talked about the light penetration, and I can get into that more when we get into photos. I'm gonna compare the metal halide and the high pressure sodium. It's the same lamp. The difference there is the bulb. Your metal halide more easily produces in the blue spectrum of light, which is better for foliage growth, which is really what we want in bonsai. Your high pressure sodium is really producing more of the red colors, which is what's used for flowering. You will see high pressure sodium lights in greenhouses all the time because they feel they have enough of the blue spectrum. They're enhancing the flowering spectrum so their plants are beautiful and flowering and ready for sale. The high pressure sodium is also the orange street lights if you're out at night. That's the color of that lamp. Again, not one that you necessarily want to be sitting around all the time. If you were to grow only with that, you would have stretched growth. It's not the way you want to go for a grow light. Last one on the list, as you can probably tell, is where I ended up, LED fixtures. Now, Jerry Meislich had great articles on why he didn't feel LEDs were ready yet, but those articles were written close to a decade ago. I think we finally made that transition where the cost of them, as well as the lifespan of the light, makes sense and is comparable to any of these others price-wise. When you think of how long it's gonna last, you're not changing bulbs. I will say energy consumption is probably close to the same, but you're producing, every watt you're using is going to light, and you're not getting that heat gain. So that is kind of what started tipping me towards the LED spectrum. Variable wattage, as many of these are, the only one that I say is low wattage is fluorescent. I think each bulb averages about 35 watts, and that's really about it. Whereas when you get into these other lamps, you start at about 250 watts, and 1,000 or 1,500 seems to be the top. I think LED potentially goes even beyond that, but that's commercial growers, totally different operation. I say they have the best spectrum because they can custom build a spectrum, and they do. The manufacturers actually like to kind of trademark their own light spectrum. And the way this works is that if you look at the bottom of one of those LED panels, it has lots of different LEDs. Those can all be a different spectrum. They do focus on the red and blue, but the manufacturer I use is Black Dog LED. They're actually out of Boulder, Colorado, and Front Range Community College alumni, so got to support fellow alumni, but they build a great light, beautiful spectrum, and they're the first, and they still might be the only that we're putting in infrared and ultraviolet LEDs into their spectrum because they considered it as a benefit to the plant. So that's kind of where I've started with the LED. They are low heat. You actually reach a point where they produce so much light. In order for the plant metabolism to keep up, you need to provide heat often in your grow room. Usually you think of cooling a grow room. LED has kind of switched that to where if you have it under intense light, you want your grow room to be at about 80 to 85 degrees so the plant metabolism can actually keep up with the high amount of light. Now I will say, I preface a lot of this with, that is a commercial grow for a cash crop. A lot of LED technology is driven by the marijuana industry to begin with. There are a lot of hydroponic growers doing gardens and so forth with it. Regardless, it is a cash crop. They're pushing those plants to their maximum to try and produce a bountiful crop quickly that's nutrient and large and everything else. Our goals are a little bit different. So while you can get these incredibly amazing spectrums, we don't necessarily want to max out our plants. So we can take that back a little bit, and I'll dive into that more a little bit later. Part of that reason is bleaching. If you don't, regardless of keeping up the plant metabolism up with the high intense light, if your light sits, if you were to put it as close as a fluorescent, you will bleach the leaves, which essentially looks almost just like leaf scorch, except instead of turning that kind of, you get that slight sunburn and then it turns brown, the leaf will just turn white and then go necrotic in those spots. And it's just too intense of a light, but I've got tricks to get around that for you too. And Andy, we're ready for the next one. Now we'll get to see that condo slider and dive into why LED became my, my choice, spectrum. So it should be the same. These photos may have swapped for online, but the photo that's in the daylight without the LED, it's kind of when we moved into that condo and I bought that shelf. It's about 6 feet tall, 2 foot depth and about 4 feet wide. Perfect dimensions. If you're gonna be moving a lot and you don't know what you're gonna do with your plants, that shelf came in so handy, so many different places, so many different windows. You can fit a lot of plants on there and it's not a super expensive piece. Now, I saw that slider and said, that's perfect. I can put all of my plants here. This will work great for me. Western exposure. If I need to, I'll close the blinds in the afternoon a little. And then notice something. And I've got that slider open a little. You might be able to see that glass is a little tinted. Does anyone know what that is?
Low E.
Perfect. Low E glass. So low E glass is what's pretty much all new windows now. It was an option for a while. It is made to really keep the temperature in your house in a better range. It reflects infrared and ultraviolet radiation, which is, the ultraviolet's gonna be what fades your furniture, the infrared is your heat. That's great for keeping your house cool in the summer, warmer in the winter, but those are spectrums that plants do want. So I didn't realize that initially, but as I was growing in those conditions without the LED, it only took a matter of time before, I mean, the growth pretty much had stalled out. And then when things did start growing, it was very stretched. Like it wasn't getting enough light. I bought that bad boy and it was getting plenty of light. Fair warning, if you set up an LED in a situation like that, about every neighbor for 5 miles is going to be convinced that you're now the marijuana distributor for the area. Thankfully, neighbors didn't care too much and it did work great for me. At this point, I was experiencing bleached leaves because you can see that light's probably about 10 inches from the canopies. That would be the minimum. And I would say you probably want that on a light mover at that point, or it's just gonna be too intense in one spot all the time. Now with that said, it's specific to certain plants. My narrowleaf ficus, jade, Brazilian rain tree, couldn't get enough. They would grow right up to those LED diodes. Whereas my tiger bark ficus, bougainvillea, and some others easily would get bleached by that light at that point. And what I ended up doing was starting to rearrange. You can almost tell I put the tiger bark ficus on the bottom shelf where there'd hopefully still be some light bleeding through, but they'd be far enough away from that light to not harm it. So again, that wire rack, bit of a pain for watering, but any gaps you left, there's not a bonsai pot sitting there, that light transferred through to the shelf below it, which was nice. Okay, Andy, we're ready for the next. Oh, we've got a question.
Yeah, so are these 12 months a year inside, or are you moving them out at all?
I do move them out. I kept them indoors for that first setup pretty well year round. Probably for the first 3 years I grew, and the pests, I got wiped out by mites and whitefly a few different times. Kind of, in my mind, thankfully, it was more house plants at that point before I got into bonsai. But there was definitely whitefly incident with bonsai that I hope I never have to deal with again. And the reason I bring that up is this time of year is usually when the pests are starting to try and take over, kind of thing. As soon as I get my trees outside for the summer, not a single problem because the predators are there to keep everything in balance. I've seen, it's a Brazilian rain tree actually. They experience a phenomenon called guttation where they will push sap out of their internodes, and it seems to attract wasps. Whether the wasps are looking for that free treat or they're looking for pests looking for that free treat, I don't know. But I've had 5 different species of wasp inspecting that tree daily in the summer when they find it. So seems to be a nice pest deterrent for me as well, to keep the wasp inspecting my trees for me. But yes, outdoors as much as I can. Beyond that, even though this thing puts out plenty of light, nothing compares to the sunlight outside if you can get your trees outside. The caveat being, even with this intense light, you do need to transition your trees. I take my trees from indoors, and when I put them outdoors, which is usually the beginning of June, sometimes I'll do it in May, I start them in the shade, pure shade, for about a week, and then I start inching them into dappled shade, into sunlight, and it's kind of a value scale. My jades end up in the highest sun, you know, the ficus or the scheffleris stay in that dappled shade, but over the course of a month, typically, I transition the trees so they can adjust. I've had jades, or if you want to experiment with it, put a jade from inside into full sun, and you will sunburn the leaves. It will keep growing, it'll keep living. It will take probably a year and a half for the tree to grow out of that sunburn. Whereas if you know, I would say have two jades that you don't care about too much, or at least one of them you don't care about. The other one transition, and just that slow change, you'll have zero sunburn on the leaves, and it will end up in that same high sun with no issues at all. And I think Schefflera is probably one of the few that I will say doesn't want direct sunlight. It will put up with a little, but that's one that I keep pretty well in dappled shade. Go for it, Andy. Any other questions on this or any of the topics we've covered so far? Yeah, I was gonna say so while my neighbors may have been a little upset by that pink and purple LED, my kitty didn't care at all. In fact, she thought it was pretty fabulous. It really turned, I've got such a understanding wife, you can switch it, to put up with this color light in our family room for a year and a half. Thankfully only in the winter months, but we went on a lot of dates in the winter months. Okay, so I want to get into terms used to describe light, because we've been talking about high intense light, the different types of grow lights you can get. Just want to talk about across the board, regardless of what type of light you're talking about, some common terminology, what's useful to us and what isn't. The first one being a lumen, which equals the brightness, which equals the visibility of that light. And I want you to key in on the word visibility or visible. That's to us, humans, not what plants can see, not what something, but us. So it's a measurement for our eyes. Kelvin is something that you're going to see a lot, and it's really, that's dealing with the color temperature of the bulb. And it's the wavelengths being produced by that bulb. This is important. You've probably heard that, and it's particularly with LEDs, that plants really only want blue and red light. That's not entirely true, but that is the majority of what they're looking for. That vegetative spectrum falls between 5,000 and 7,000 Kelvin. Those are your blue lights. The flowering spectrum from 2,700 to 3,500 Kelvin, that is your flowering spectrum. You can use those individually. So there's, on a plant, on the leaf, there are two different photoreceptors. One is absorbing that blue light, one is absorbing that red light. They don't really mix in that sense. But if you only have blue light, you're only using half of the potential photosynthesis of that plant. Why not use them both? And saying that it's vegetative or flowering is mostly true. I think it's a bit of a generalization just because it came in through the flowering photospectrum. If it has a need, it's producing sugars, right? If the plant has a need for it elsewhere, I can't see why it wouldn't be able to do that. Additionally, beyond this, plants don't just grow vegetatively and flowering. They have a lot of other processes. To have a healthy and robust plant, you should give it that full spectrum, because that's going to help encourage what are called secondary metabolites, which often are related to plant defenses. So the healthier plant you have, the more robust it is, the more able it is to fight off if it does get a pest or a disease. So even in your lighting, having full spectrum is important. So now we get into PAR, or P-A-R. It stands for photosynthetically active radiation. The crux of that, that's the light that plants are looking for. All light is a form of radiation, so this is photosynthetically active light. That's exactly what we should be keying in on for plants. From there, it gets a little technical, but really, it's just the way they're measuring that PAR. So the ppf, the photosynthetic photon flux, that's the number of photons that are being produced per second. So really, if you had that grow light and you had a way to measure PAR, which is the ppf, it's sitting right here. It's measuring that bulb and it's telling you this is how many photons per second in that photosynthetic active range are being produced. So we're getting close. We just want it where the canopy is going to be. That's your ppfd, photosynthetic photon flux density. In my mind, that D always becomes distance from the light. That's what I want to measure where we're going to be actually growing things. So that's measuring at your canopy height. Every manufacturer is going to have a specified height of where you should have your plants. You can play with that. And then if you wanted to, you could grab a measuring tool and measure this. If you're buying LED lights or even metal halide at this point, in the case of metal halide, your bulb is going to tell you a lot of these readings when you're purchasing it. If it's a grow bulb, with your LED fixtures, it should be all over their website, all over their light, everywhere, because if they're a reputable manufacturer, they're proud of what they're putting out, and that look at the spectrum we've been able to produce for you. So it is something that you should see. As far as the measurements and so forth, it does get very technical. However, I do have a reference at the end that does a great job of explaining it in more detail if anyone wants to dive deeper. And it's actually, I have 3 references, because every LED manufacturer wants to say they're the best, right? So I tried to give you a spread so that you can look at them all and make your own conclusions. We're ready for the next one. I will say that 400 to 900 ppfd is your optimal growth range, and that's when if you have a PAR meter. That 900 ppfd, again, that's probably your commercial crops. We're probably in more of the 400 to 500 range. We want to give our plants good healthy life, or healthy lights, but we're not trying to push them to produce a cash crop for us. Gary.
So you're talking about tropicals here, but what about, say, like I have a cold frame that doesn't get any sunlight.
Mm-hmm.
Do those need any kind of light during wintertime?
So they're dormant plants, right?
Dormant plants like spruce and pine.
Spruce and pine, if they're evergreen, they will benefit from some light. If they're dormant, deciduous, and they're out of leaf, there's not a need for it. If you were to do that, I would say they don't need a ton of light. You don't want to risk scorching them, or in this case, bleaching. So you could get away with a lower model to cover a larger area, basically, or back that light up. You know, it may be marketed for a 2-foot footprint, but you might be able to push it to 4 feet because you want that light to be less by the time it hits your canopy. Just hang your light a bit higher. I hope this graph, that was a lot of information about light and light quality. Full disclosure, it comes from Black Dog LED. I highly recommend going to their website. They do have a lot of great science that they put into their lights and so forth. I do have a reference at the end, but again, as well as 2 others to give you, so you can look at the other manufacturers as well, see what everyone's saying, and draw your own conclusions. But what's great on this graph, if you're looking at this, we talked about lumens are important to the human eye, what we're seeing. That is that yellow line, okay, so which peaks at the 550 mark, 550 to 600. PAR, for photosynthetically active radiation, that is the green line. It's almost the exact opposite. So the lumens and the light we see have no bearing on what the plants are actually looking for. I thought about taking the purple line out. That's Black Dog LED's spectrum that they have, but I wanted to leave it in because any manufacturer is going to have probably a bar that looks somewhat similar to that, and that's what you want to be keying in on. So here it's in nanometers. Little bit different than Kelvin, but it's measuring the same things here. So that 450 nanometers, if you look just below it, it's blue. Those are your blue lights. Opposite over here, you're looking at the 650 to just under 700 nanometers. Those are your red lights. So those are the peaks in your photosynthesis, but you can see there is still some needed in that center range, just not nearly as much. So that is where having a full spectrum, not just red, not just blue, definitely want the full spectrum, but balancing it right so that it's producing as much photosynthetically active radiation as possible gives you the best bang for your buck for whatever light you're going to purchase, if you go that route. Question?
Do you have a tool or a meter you use to kind of validate how well it's working?
So in college we used them. We had par meters that would read and it was kind of early on. PPF and PPFD are the new meters that are measuring the actual photons hitting a surface. I want to say they're $150 for a meter. There might be a cheaper option, but you want to make sure you get one that works. They're very easy to use. I will say that I've seen, and it's biased again, but many LED manufacturers testing their lights, moving around the room, and then honestly, it's the same LED manufacturers then refuting each other's evidence and coming up with their own scientific reason and why their results are valid and the other person's isn't. And that's why I say, like, look at a bunch of it. I think if any of them are giving you pretty much a trademark spectrum, it'd be hard to go wrong. And if they're peaking in the blues and purples, sorry, the blues and reds, hard to go wrong. Black Dog, so those original photos you saw, that was their generation 1 light, and it was purely focused on photosynthesis, right? Incredibly purple light. They're now on generation 2. They actually added the blue and yellows in, not a ton of them, small amount. From my understanding, it wasn't so much because they realized some of that was needed for photosynthesis as much as it was to make it a little more pleasing to be around. So it looks more white to our eyes. It's definitely much easier to be around than the old generation. But some of that is used for photosynthesis and, again, producing those secondary metabolites to be a plant defense. We're going to switch from lighting. So if there's any other questions in regards to this, I'd love to cover them before we move on. Okay, we'll move on to the next one. We already had a few hints on this is all tropicals inside. What about outdoors? So you can see my bench, this picture on the right, that's my tropicals in the summer. That's when we lived in that condo. In the summer, I'd put everything out there I could. Again, west facing. They absolutely loved it out there. On the left is a photo from my first house where I had the stacked greenhouse windows. My garage, I didn't have a yard, so it was a standalone home, but all the property outside was shared. So I had a small patio and a garage. My garage had a little window inset. I built a shelf, built a frame, and lined the frame with 3mm plastic on both sides. Basically built just a small cold frame. Worked great for the 2 or 3 years I was there to use it. I could either open the window to outside if it was getting warm in the winter to try and stabilize things because that garage could heat up, or I could close that window and open it to the garage to get some radiant heat from the house when it got super cold. And I'd keep my eyes on the forecast like we all do and run out there and switch it to whatever setup I needed. And you might be able to make out on the left is a sensor that's telling me temperature and humidity, and that was another just little fail-safe for me to check on and make sure everything was going okay. Now this grow bench that I had at the condo, a lot of that's tropical sitting there, but you will see a juniper and so forth. This bench I built to a specific size. In the winter months, the plants would all come off initially. I had a propagation mat that is the exact size of the top of that bench, which is basically a heat blanket for plants. I would put I actually built boards to build basically a box around that flat top. Put some mulch in it, start putting the trees in, mulch them in, and plug the propagation mat into a thermostat that had a soil probe that I put in my favorite tree's root ball and set it to whatever temperature I want, keep the roots warm all winter. And that is a west-facing exposure. I had all of my outdoor trees out there November 2014. If any of you recall, a lot of trees died that winter from a huge temperature flux we had. Didn't lose a single thing because of the roots stayed the same temperature. And then in my mind, I believe it was just that radiant heat was keeping those trunks and branches warm enough when we had those really severe temperature swings. So not only can you overwinter your trees, but there's an added layer of protection. obviously there's a cost. That propagation mat runs pretty constantly through the winter, depending on what you get in that regard. Some of them will cycle on, cycle off, but it is a cost. Heating with electricity is not cheap. Any questions on this so far, outdooring on patios? Because I can go on to say, like, had another place I lived that I did not take the bench with me. I ended up building just an oversized grow box and using the same concept. I put down the propagation mat first. It was wide enough that there was drainage on the sides. Put in some mulch, put in the trees, mulched everything in. Keeps everything great through the winter months if you don't have access to a yard. The one change I would make, I used a propagation mat. I've now switched to using more of like heating cables. Then you have zero drainage issues, because I would get issues with water puddling on top of that mat, and water and electricity, one of those things I didn't want to play with too long. But we're ready for the next slide if there are no questions on this. And I'm hoping this is digestible information. Please speak up if any questions you guys have. Okay, on to low wattage college. I'd already been in school at this point, but the time came to transfer to CSU, so I rented a room in LaPorte, just north of Fort Collins, and that wire shelf came with me. Worked absolutely fantastic. I used 2 fluorescent fixtures during this time, knowing that there's a good chance my landlord might throw a fit if they see lights on all the time, particularly super bright pink ones. She did have an issue at first, and I said, if there's a change in your electric bill, let me know, I'll cover the difference. 2 fluorescent fixtures, there was never enough of a change in the electric bill to need to pay the difference. This did work absolutely excellent for me in school. So I was commuting. I would stay up in LaPorte during the week and come home on the weekends to see my wife. So while I was up there, study, keep my nose in the books. Well, eventually you need a break, turn around, and I had a shelf of bonsai to look at, wire, prune. Didn't do any repotting in the room, but it was a great break. And then by the time I got done messing with the tree for a while, back to the studies I went. As you can see, the plants are pretty crammed in. So there wasn't adequate space, and that has been a shortcoming for me for a long time. I think all of us fill the space we have with plants as we gain that ability. However, continuing to kind of move them on those shelves to different locations and rotate them regularly, they did do just fine. And I think the addition of me taking study breaks and pruning them kept them from getting too big to growing into each other and taking over, which was fine for that year. Wouldn't recommend that long term. It's better to no tree can be in show quality all the time. Let it grow out some and then bring it back. You'll have a much healthier tree overall. The other thing I want to point out, there's a fan in this photo. I started using a fan before this, but it showed up in this photo, and it really became like an important thing to me. I can't tell you how much an oscillating fan, or a fan that keeps air moving in your grow space, helps. It keeps fungi and bacteria from being able to settle out of the air. Mites hate warm, humid air. And when I had dust mite issues, it was before I had a fan. Since I've had an oscillating fan, I've not had an issue with mites. I hope that stays true, but it really helps keep the problem at bay. Lastly, it strips the boundary layer away from your leaves and your canopy. The easiest way to explain this, if you've been somewhere humid and it's stagnant and you can feel the condensation starting to beat up on yourself, think of a plant leaf the same way. If it's stagnant and there's no air moving, this layer of humidity just kind of develops around the leaf, and photosynthesis will stall out. The plant can handle that. It's fine. It will go dormant. But anytime we're driving photosynthesis, we're helping create the plant to, one, have its metabolizer running and creating sugars and starches and everything it needs to function. Hence, you have a healthier plant. So just by having that fan moving air, you're helping that plant grow more healthily for 2 major reasons. So this was kind of the college. While I was up there, while it lasted, this did very, very well for me. Eastern exposure in the morning did great. I want to say that Western exposure can be kind of tough. I recommend a mini blind to filter at least a little of that afternoon light. Eastern exposure, I didn't need any of that. Southern exposure would be the same. You're going to want to have something to filter some of that light. Going through these, I think at a decent pace. How are we doing? Are you guys, any questions I can answer? Am I explaining this in depth? Because we're gonna change. We got another.
Do you have a recommendation for a good thermostat that you could tie to your phone that lasts? I can't find one.
Is this for the overwintering?
It's for a hoop house, and I've got a nice Inkbird one, but they only last about a year.
Oh, really? I've been using Inkbird, and they seem to. I've had them for 5-6 years running. I used to get from a greenhouse supplier a gas-filled probe on a thermostat that was supposed to be more sensitive, but you can only bend that probe so many times before it breaks and the gas escapes, and it was more expensive. It was like twice the cost of an Inkbird. So my Inkbird have lasted me multiple years, the ones I've used. I don't know who to recommend other than that.
So mine will go, 20 below to 70 in a day. I don't know if that's.
Huh. I can't believe that's accurate. Something must be off. Is yours a soil probe?
I have multiple temperature sensors. The Inkbirds just don't last for me.
Huh, interesting. I wish I had a recommendation. We're ready for the next slide, Andy. Oh, Daryl.
In this situation, you haven't talked about humidity. Have you tried to supplement with a humidifier? Or
I did that early on.
it looks like it's about 2% in my house
Right.
without something helping.
I did supplement humidity early on. To be honest, when I have a plant that's suffering, I'll use a humidity dome or a humidity tent to pamper that plant. In this situation, in the condo, so in our first house, I was always, I was lucky if the humidity in the house was at 16%. The condo, with my plants, and my wife put a pot of boiling water on the stove, we'd be at 50% humidity in 10 minutes. So there was zero issue there. Same here. It was an upper story room, and just with my plants in it was enough. Honestly, like once I get my plants going and I have a fan going as well, even I think it's the next setup that'll be shown, it was a guest bedroom, and I'd keep both doors open and it would still get hot and humid in there. I don't know if it's the same, but it's the number of plants and that fan moving with lights kind of creates its own environment. I've never had to supplement humidity since I've done that. I will say in my house now, and you can change, Andy, my house now it's new, number one, so the humidity is non-existent, and it's large enough we're struggling to find a way to keep the humidity up. I've basically built a grow room to contain it to help keep that temperature and humidity up. So I'm considering those things, just using the plants and building a system instead of supplementing humidity, if that makes sense. All right, water quality. I think you guys have heard enough about light. We'll talk about water quality a bit. So as I've moved to all these places, things would kind of change on me. Sometimes things are easier. Sometimes things like, why are my plants struggling on me? Started dawning on me, maybe water quality is changing. So pH is the first thing that people like to key in on. And pH is important. It is the hydrogen ion concentration in your water. For plant growth, optimum is 5 to 7 pH. I'm going to say now if you're doing hydroponics, you want to be closer to that 5 range. And bonsai with bonsai soil is kind of a hybrid between hydroponics and aeroponics. So if you're using, I typically, if I'm adjusting I use acidic fertilizers, and a lot of times my pH will end up near 5. And particularly with bougainvillea, that's when they're happy. If I change out of that, or the soil temperature gets cold, they'll get chlorotic and start getting yellow leaves on me really quickly and easily. Now, when you're testing out of the tap, along the front range, everything I've tested, occasionally you'll see a 7. More likely it's 8 or 9. I know Denver recently changed the pH of their water for public health to prevent leaching of heavy metals from pipes, old pipes, so it's a good thing. Now the difference being what they had to do to change their pH was minor because their water quality is fairly pure. Changing the water quality from an area that's very alkaline, like Parker Highlands Ranch, takes more because you're dealing with a higher alkalinity, which is that next test mentioned there. Now I will say I do not have an alkalinity test. You can get them from an aquarium shop. I know from the water stains that appear on, well, not on the glasses, but on the plumbing fixtures and so forth, becomes apparent really quickly, the water quality. And I'll say by testing pH and the total dissolved solids, you usually get a pretty good idea. So that is TDS, total dissolved solids, that's that last measurement. Personally, pH and TDS does enough for me. I am at some point going to get an alkalinity test just to satisfy that curiosity, but it hasn't been pertinent for what I've needed so far. Now, your total dissolved solids, that's going to be predominantly the salts and minerals that are dissolved in your water, straight out of the tap. So 130 to 300 parts per million is your optimum for greenhouse growth. This comes from a Penn State Extension article, which I do have reference to in the back. Would be a great resource for all of this. Now, measuring straight out of the tap in Denver and Aurora, I've measured typically between 250 and 300 parts per million, so you are good to go. When I lived in Parker, Meridian, and Highlands Ranch, the tests were coming in at 750 to 900 parts per million, which is almost 3 times as much. So and that's pretty much all limestone. So that's calcium carbonate and bicarbonate, magnesium carbonate and bicarbonate. So it's going to change. You can still grow in these conditions. It's just going to change the way you need to think about things. I like to say that when I lived in Parker Highlands Ranch, anywhere on a limestone aquifer, my soil would become exhausted after the course of a year, year and a half. What I mean by that is your soil has cation exchange capacity, its ability to grab positively charged things, typically your fertilizer, but calcium and magnesium are positively charged. And when you're flooding it with tons of calcium and magnesium every time you water, you tend to occupy all of those sites. So then you start getting deficiencies in iron and other things, and it just becomes a more difficult situation to manage. Being that we're bonsai artists, we tend to repot fairly often anyways, it just increased that frequency for me. Whereas in Denver and Aurora, you might be able to keep plants in those, as long as you have a decent leaching requirement in the summer months, you could probably keep plants in those pots forever if it wasn't for the roots growing and needing to refurbish that soil. Any questions on this? You guys are probably familiar with pH. Mike?
So how are you testing and what would you recommend in terms of a frequency? Are you going to a lab and you do it every year, or what do you think?
Perfect. So first and foremost, your city tests its water quality monthly. You can go online and pretty much all you need to do is type in your city's name and water quality, and it'll take you to the site that has your city's water reports. That's an easy way. Now, if you really want to geek out and do it at home, pH testing kits, I mean, this is all available on Amazon, aquarium stores, sometimes even your local greenhouses. They'll typically have a pH testing kit. Aquarium shops for sure will have all of this. Your pH testing kit and your alkalinity testing kit, it's either going to be a liquid or a test strip. I would think that's going to be in the $10 range, maybe $15 range. Your TDS meter, there are some expensive ones, but you can get cheap ones that work just as well for about $15. The one thing I'll say there is it's good to keep like a jug of distilled water around. When you're done using the tool, you want to rinse it with pure water so you keep the calibration right the next time you use it. As far as frequency, anytime I move, the frequency would be almost every time I'm preparing water, just to get myself in the rhythm of where I'm at and what I need to do. Once I get in that rhythm, I like to do at minimum spring and fall, particularly if you're on an aquifer. In the spring, your wells have recharged, if there's been any recharge, and you're going to have the freshest water quality possible. Through the summer, with you watering your trees, people washing their cars, people watering their lawns and everything else, and it was a dry summer, that aquifer goes down, it's going to be more concentrated. You're going to probably see those total dissolved solids go up as well as your pH. Testing those 2 times a year can kind of give you that flux. And then, you know, the first year, add a few more in there, but you can get a general idea of what your water quality is doing through the year. If it's doing anything, depends on the municipality. Alkalinity is one alkalinity is measuring, it's measuring the calcium and magnesium carbonate and bicarbonate level load in your water, which can be important if you have those higher loads, not critical if you're doing the TDS. Anyone here familiar with using a TDS meter or any other questions about it? It's very simple.
Is there a risk of having too few TDS?
Yes, fantastic. Go ahead and go to the next slide, but I'll take off on that point. If you use a reverse osmosis water purifier, it will take basically everything out. And that's what's pictured on the lower left here. It's a series of 4 filters, and I would put water in there that's at the 700 to 900 parts per million. It would come out the other end at like 4 or 12 parts per million. You want to have at least 130. It's what's called buffering your water. The pure water is actually corrosive. If you drink it, if you held it in your mouth long enough, it'll pull the minerals out of your teeth to fill it back up with something. Had an instance in the place I work in California, we didn't have a neutralizer loop after the reverse osmosis water system, and it was pulling the copper out of the pipes and staining things green from oxidized copper. So pure water, not good. It will stress us out, it will stress your plants out. The 2 simplest ways to do this, simplest and cheapest, so I gotta say, I do have a reverse osmosis water filter. I used it when I was in Highlands Ranch. Now in Aurora, I don't have a need to use it. The downside to these, they've become much, much more efficient, but for every gallon of water you produce, another gallon of water went down the drain to make it. So you are using a lot more water to do it. Now to get those 130 parts per million, the easiest thing to do is fill your jug a quarter with tap water and then fill the rest with RO, test it. See if you're at your range and adjust. Do I need a half gallon of tap, an 1/8 gallon of tap? That's your simplest way. You will still have some chlorine to deal with, which is minor, but if you're doing the organic route and that's a concern to you, you can, or you just want to geek out on exactly knowing everything that is going into your water. It's called CalMag. It's calcium and magnesium, usually paired with nitrogen. If you get it from Roots Organic, it's paired with sulfur. I've become obsessed with limiting the nitrogen and phosphorus to see if I can push it. It's kind of its own geeky thing, but with organic hydroponics, you can any hydroponics, you can get CalMag, different formulations to do that for you. Okay, already talked about where you can get these meters and so forth. Already actually talked about the cities providing these. Acid injection. So a greenhouse will use strong acids for acid injection, and that is not what I'm promoting. What I'm promoting is weak acids, acetic acid, which is distilled white vinegar. You can add, it's about 1.5 milliliters to 1,500 milliliters, and it will bring your water quality to neutral. And you can test with that. You know, make yourself up a jug of water and add a little vinegar, see what it did to your pH. Add a little more, see what it did to your pH. Honestly, I like to do that. And then I like to add my fertilizer and then see what it did to my pH again, so that I can get an idea of how far do I need to add a lot of vinegar? Do I not need to? At this point, I am adding a little bit of vinegar, primarily just to get rid of the buffer. I'm not sure what the municipalities add to increase pH, but adding just a little vinegar brings you back down to neutral if you need it. Now, if you're using acidic fertilizers, there's a good chance you don't need it, unless you're in the Highlands Ranch, one of the places with a limestone aquifer. So we moved again. My setup changed a little. I was now in a basement in Westminster. No more issues with the light disturbing the neighbors. You can see I've got 2 fans going now. This was a fun setup, fun place to be. The issues I started running into here, being in the basement, it was cold. Out of constant deficiency issues And I was racking my brain saying, like, I know I have good light. I know I've been monitoring the water quality. I know how to do all of this. And it was, the whole time, it was just that the temperature of the soil was probably sitting at about 50 degrees, too cold for tropicals, and not all of them, but some of them would always be giving me different deficiency issues. Wasn't able to correct that here. I had to move on to do that. And let's go to the next slide, unless there's more questions. All right, get into fertilizers. So we've dealt with light, we've dealt with their water. Now what are you going to use to fertilize your plants? Synthetic fertilizer is where I recommend people start because it's typically balanced. At this point, most of them have their micronutrients, and that's the one thing I'd say. Make sure your fertilizer has its micronutrients, or you're buying a micronutrient fertilizer in addition. It's very easy to use. You follow the instructions. A lot of people, particularly bonsaiists, will say, cut the recommendation in half. I will say I had a year where I actually, and this is where at least once a year I want to review my parameters, because I had a year that for whatever reason my measurements got mixed up and I was fertilizing 3 times the dosage. It was synthetic fertilizer. I thought my leaves looked awfully blue-green, and it just confirmed it for me. Everything lived and was okay, but that's not the kind of growth and the kind of responses that you want to push. Additionally, I'll say, like, when you're producing trees, when you're just trying to grow stock on, overdoing the fertilizer or using specific fertilizers could be a good thing. You're really trying to push rapid growth. Once you've kind of created a refined bonsai and it started to settle into a shape you enjoy, you don't want it to push out of that. It still needs to grow, but you'd rather have slow, controlled growth, finer ramification, so you can continue to make this tree more and more beautiful through the years, rather than having to cut off these shoots that it tries to shoot out. Every time fertilizer comes up, everyone wants to know, what do you use? I'll say there's 1,000 options, tons of good ones. I want to get into some of the basics, some of the ones that I've used, the upside, downside, and we'll go, and you can take that information and use it how you'd like. So the NPK, that is the ratio that's going to be listed on any fertilizer. Does anyone here not know what that stands for? That is your nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Those are your macronutrients. The only thing a plant needs more than that is hydrogen, oxygen, carbon. So that, you can see 936 on the Foliage Pro, that's what those numbers are. That's your NPK. Every fertilizer should have that on it somewhere. Now, typically you want it balanced. I'm going to say for bonsai, probably don't want the number over 15, although I've had it at 20. That foliage, well, let's start with Osmocote. Osmocote on the end, great fertilizer. That's Osmocote Plus. So what the plus means with minors. Really the only downside to that is that it's not attractive sitting on the surface of your soil of your bonsai. I do still use some of it, but I'll actually dig a hole in the soil and drop some pellets in and cover it back over. And honestly, I do that often, like a month before a show, so that I can still fertilize the tree, but let the moss do its thing and settle in, and I don't have to worry about it. The second one is Dynagrow Foliage Pro. I used this for years. I still have some. My wife actually uses it on her plants now. That ratio is 9:3:6. Dynagrow came up with that ratio because they tested multiple plant foliages, and they always found, almost all the time, the ratio of those nutrients in the plants themselves was 9:3:6. Hence they produced this fertilizer. It also has the micros. It is slightly acidic. I found that it worked nicely with the water coming off limestone aquifers to acidify it enough to bring it back. And it had great results with growth and everything else. I know quite a few people who use it. This next one is called Grow and Gain. It comes from a company called BGI. It's Bougainvillea Growers International. I used to absolutely love all the different varieties of bougainvilleas that they would keep. I don't think they grow them anymore. They do still produce fertilizers. The Bogain fertilizer is fantastic. This Grow and Gain fertilizer is not for bonsai artists unless you're trying to do something crazy. It is urea fertilizer. And so there's going to be 3 forms of nitrogen that you'll typically see listed on a fertilizer: ammonium, nitrate, and nitrite fertilizer. Urea will break down into ammonium, 2 of them. So it is a cheap nitrogen fertilizer, and ammonium in a plant is kind of like junk food. You're going to get crazy growth. I had Norway maple, still have it, was recently collected, feeding it this fertilizer. It grew 6 6-foot whips off the top of the tree. So crazy growth. Not what we want for bonsai unless you're really going to try something crazy. But good to know, if you see a urea fertilizer, probably not what you want for bonsai. Additionally, it should be the cheapest thing you find, because you're getting twice the nitrogen in one package. So it really should be a cheap fertilizer. You want a pretty nice mix of ammonium and nitrate to give you a balance in that fertilizer, so you get really 2 kinds of growth out of your plant. Lastly, this one on the side, Tazula plants. I don't know anything else Tazula plants does other than package my favorite fertilizer, synthetic fertilizer, in a 2-pound bag. It says MSU fertilizer. That's Michigan State University. They had a project. They basically wanted to create a fertilizer for orchids. Knowing that orchids like fairly pure water, they started with RO water and said, what fertilizer can we build that'll cover everything that the plant needs, put it at a perfect pH and the perfect total dissolved solids? And this is what they developed. It works fantastic. I have a root on rock bougainvillea. It's kind of like a wabikusa or terrarium with a bougainvillea growing on it. The downside of this fertilizer is I believe it has a pH indicator, and it will start dyeing the rock kind of a green-blue color, as well as I've just found with synthetics in general, they'll kind of start to crystallize on the outside of the rock, whereas organics don't. But for synthetics, I do still use this fertilizer. I absolutely love it. I have links, reference at the end of this presentation to articles that cover basically how they developed this fertilizer. And it's a great reading for greenhouse growing operations, for water quality, and for fertilizer building. Tons of great knowledge in it. And we're ready for the next slide. Question?
On the Tazula, it says that it is, NPK ratio, but then it says tap water, rainwater,
Yes.
and RO. So it'll work across the board like that?
Thank you for bringing that up. When they say tap, they're talking Denver, Aurora, 250 to 300 parts per million water. That fertilizer will work for RO, rainwater, or high quality tap water. They actually have a different formula for wells, which is a more acidic fertilizer, and they drop the calcium and magnesium because you have plenty in it. It's been a long time since I've looked for that well water version, but it should still be out there. There's several manufacturers that produce these now. Go for it.
So a question for you, and I'm going to try and answer it, and then you can see if I'm understanding
Okay.
this correctly. The fertilizers you had up there had fairly high NPK numbers on them.
Yes.
Are those going to be more for development? And then I know when I get the organic, Bonsai specialized fertilizers, they're very low numbers.
Yes.
And is that more maintenance?
So, man, that's like a yes and a no, like to clear things up. Almost any synthetic fertilizer is going to have numbers at 10 or a little above, and it's just because it's already mineralized, ready for your plant to take up. Whereas your organic fertilizers are, as they're unmineralized, it is not ready for the plant to take up. It needs something to break it into a mineralized form to be taken up. So it could have the same load as your synthetic fertilizer, it's just going to break down slowly and release it to the plant, as long as it stays in the soil profile. I would say you're accurate. I like the way you're thinking. It's the way I think. I think an alternate would be to reduce the potency that you're giving the plant. So like a lot of bonsai artists say, cut your fertilizer recommendation in half so that you're watering with a diluted rate. That would be another route. The issue with organics, and the organic dilemma, is bonsai soil by nature is low in fertility. It's mostly inorganic. it's gravel, right? I still put some bark mulch in mine, and I need to start putting some orchid growers bark back in it to provide an organic component, because with no organic component, no soil microbiota have a place to live in the soil. And if there's no soil microbiota, they can't break down the organic fertilizer to then feed it to your plant. So initially, this has been a quest. I've been trying to make organics with bonsai work for probably close to 3 years now, and have gone through this deficiency, feed it some synthetic Tazula, bring it back, and I started keying in to where I could make the bonsai happy or I could make the moss happy, but not both. It kind of shift back and forth. And I'm finally reaching a point where I think I'm keyed in. And the key has really been this Activera. So this is the organic line that I'm using now. I will say in the summer I do use Fox Farms Happy Frog general purpose fertilizer. There's thousands. You don't have to use this line. I keyed in on this through researching vivariums, which are terrariums with exotic frogs in them. If you know amphibians, they're incredibly sensitive to chemicals and so forth, so you have to have pure things. And I was trying to do kind of the Wabikusa bougainvillea and thinking like, well, if I can follow those guidelines, maybe that's the secret. In some regards it is. So this is all low dosage. Typically, if it's an organic fertilizer, your numbers are going to be under 10. Now it can still carry that load after it's broken down, but it's only going to be broken down by your soil microbiota, which are working, if they're in there, in unison with your plants. So you shouldn't have an issue where you could burn the plants and risk damage to the plant or extreme growth like you're talking about. This BioGrow is basically the nitrogen formula. The readings change on it as I was looking at labels for this. The one I have is a 307. I'm intentionally limiting phosphorus. I put rock phosphate in my soil. The goal being that's what mycorrhizal fungi will often exchange with plants. If it's in rock form, it's not absorbable to the plant, so I'm hoping to encourage the fungus to work with the plant and get that relationship going. The Algamic is basically cold-pressed kelp and seaweed. It's a micronutrient blend, also a stress reliever, but it's very high in cytokinins as well. Cytokinins are responsible for branch ramification, and they are produced in the roots of plants. However, to my knowledge, the roots or the cytokinins produced in roots are not the ones found in the leaves. They don't really know how that happens. Beyond that, I don't know if the roots have the ability to absorb cytokinins. Certainly can't hurt. I just don't know if it's actually providing a benefit or not. The Activera is made from the aloe plant. It's filled with vitamins and enzymes. This is what's critical because those will work in your inorganic soil to break down and basically chelate the organic properties into a mineralized form. This is how I've avoided deficiencies in bonsai. I have used another product called Canazyme, but it also has phosphorus in it, which I'm personally trying to avoid, hence the reason I've keyed in on this product. The last one is BioBloom. That does have phosphorus in it. Really, that combined with this is supposed to be kind of your balanced fertilizer. I use it from time to time, but to be honest, I'm only in state 50% of the time right now, so my wonderful wife helps take care of my trees for me. I leave her the simple Tazula plants, so my plants get a little synthetic kick once a month while I'm out of town, and I'm doing this the rest of the time. That's kind of my, we've got one more slide with all the references, and I want to point out a few. Go for it, Rich.
Yeah, Paul, does Algamic, if I pronounce that correctly,
Yep.
does that contain an iron compound of some sort that is beneficial for?
Yes. So it is, to my understanding, so the one thing that gets frustrating with organics is they don't often break down everything that's in there. However, cold pressed kelp is supposed to be incredibly high in all of your micronutrients, calcium and iron in particular. Anything else? I definitely want to point out a few references for you guys. Let's see. Argo Bill, the orchid fertilizer. myorchidcare.com. That is the site that they do have the MSU fertilizer for sale. However, it's priced highly there in small quantities. You can find it better other places, but that is where the great links to the scientific studies. It's 5 different papers written that go into great depth and detail on a lot of this if you want more info. BioBiz. So their education, Black Dog LED, that's obviously going to be the manufacturer I use. Justin Gomez in Why is PAR rating a big deal? That's from Grow Ace. So they just provide LED lighting and greenhouse equipment. So it's a little more non-biased article coming out of them. And then measuring light output of LED grow lights. Again, an LED manufacturer, biased towards there, but good information that I found. The CO or RO C-top, that is that countertop RO reverse osmosis water system I use. That one was about $250. Downside of that one is that it works off the water pressure of your sink and produces a gallon every 20 minutes. If you get to the ones that are under sink, I think they're only like $75 more, and it comes with a pressure tank to where it's going to fill that pressure tank, which is typically a 3 to 5 gallon tank, and you'll have access to 3 to 5 gallons all the time, and it will recharge what you take out. Lastly, the Swisstock, Brian Swisstock, interpreting irrigation water tests. That is the Penn State Extension article. If you are concerned about your water quality, type in your city and water quality, find your city's water reports, pull up that article with it, and you can look at all the parameters and say, hey, I'm good to go. Or, all right, I'm pretty good, but my calcium's a little high. I need to figure out what to do about that. Definitely great references. I mean, a lot of this I have in my head from school, but I wanted to make sure and back it up with good sources for you guys to dive deeper on any of this. And I'd love to entertain more questions about the grow situations I've encountered or any of this information. I'm happy to, I want this to be useful to the club and keep us growing beautiful trees.
Do you change your fertilizer at all in the winter compared to the summer, or do you do the same fertilizer routine all year?
Typically I will feed heavier in the summer. In the winter, for my outdoor trees, I'm really not fertilizing. If your soil temp's below 50 degrees, nothing's really going on. I do at the end of the season give them like a slow release organic on the top of the soil, figuring because I heat the soil bed, maybe a little something happens in there, but I otherwise leave it alone. Indoors, I keep a pretty steady feed, but I'm trying. In the early days of using grow lights, it seemed like the growth I produced was always stretched, and I was pruning it off in the spring because I was not happy with it. By increasing the light quality, reducing the amount of fertilizer, it seems to have reined in that growth a little bit, so I'm happy with my growth year round. I will say it does still stall out. Like when I first got a grow light, after 4 months, I'm like, this thing hasn't grown at all. What's going on? Like your tropical plants they don't have a cold dormancy, they typically have a dry dormancy. I used to play with that and let them go drier in the winter months. You can do that. You don't need to. Like through the winter months now, with keeping things watered and under good lights and good temperature, it'll cycle from dormant to growing 2 or 3 times. So I'll get another 2 or 3 rounds of growth, which helps produce trees more quickly. The feeding more in the summer is typically because everything's in one place and I'm mixing up a batch of fertilizer and I'm going at it. On top of that, the winter seems like really detail oriented. One of those, you saw my grow room, like those in the past used to take trees to the sink and water them. At this point, I use a gallon of water a day to water my indoor trees. My wife is now pretty well keyed into, we know pretty much exactly how much each pot needs to keep it going in the winter. In the summertime, you will build up salts in the winter. So in the summertime, by being able to leach all of that through, you're helping refresh that soil. And I would definitely recommend that if you're on a limestone aquifer. Push the water through, and with that, you're your fertilizer regime will go up to compensate for leaching more water.
Are these fertilizer recommendations for tropicals only, or do they apply to
Should be
Colorado natives?
should be across the board. The thing I would say, like with any of this, is with our pines and stuff, we're gonna hit them with that acidic fertilizer from time to time. Honestly, typically with our water quality, we're doing that anyways. So I've really found across the board that this works pretty well. The key difference being the BioBiz. I can't say that I've tested that on my outdoors. Usually it's the Fox Farms Happy Frog organic fertilizer at that point. But I do want to say, like, don't key in on, it doesn't have to be a specific fertilizer. If you know how to read that NPK, if you know how to know that the micronutrients are in there, those are the key things. If you get into the organics, you can geek out so many different ways on where they source it, what's it made of, which can be important, isn't always critical. I think knowing your nutrient loads. However, it's I know you and Ryan Neal love it, the BioGold. I think there's a ton of information on there, but it's in a different language, right? So that for me has always just been a hiccup of, like, I really want to know what's going into it, and that's just me being a plant nerd. The BioGold does incredible stuff, right? So if you have a decent organic fertilizer, you don't have to shy away from it by any means. They're on some level all equal, different ratios, but beyond that, they're fairly equal. You can find what works for you and what you're happy with. I would say just make sure in Colorado, paying attention to that acidifying factor, typically because of our water quality.
You mentioned trying to cultivate a relationship between, like, bioactives, like mycorrhiza, in the plants to uptake more nutrients. Have you ever tried to supplement those bioactives? Like, a lot of the commercial products available have some, like, beneficial bacillus in addition to mycorrhiza? And if so, do you actually test for their presence, or do you just kind of hope that they're associating in a nutrient deficient environment and kind of creating that relationship?
So I have added the Happy Frog fertilizer comes with a bunch of beneficial fungi. However, it's geared towards vegetable gardens, which are going to be your ectomycorrhizae, and typically for woody plants we need endomycorrhizae. I have used endomycorrhizae built for trees and shrubs on my bonsai. I'm not doing any scientific studies. I will say when I mix compost and mulch in with my soil, I'm still getting the balance down. For the first few months I will see deficiencies because uncomposted wood material will soak up all the nutrients. I juice it with some synthetic fertilizer, I get everything functioning. For the next year and a half, every time I pull my bamboo skewer, my moisture meter out, it's covered in white fungi. So I know something's going on in there. After a year and a half, I think it chews through all of that, and then it pretty much goes back to nothing. And that's where the Activera helps supplement, where I don't have a colony of bacteria and fungi to help me along. More to come. I need to get a higher ratio of orchid growers bark because it won't suck up as many nutrients, but it takes 5 years plus to break down. So I'm hoping that will kind of help stimulate, because essentially whether it's bacteria or fungi, they need something to live on. Fungi like to live on woody material. Bacteria tend to be more nitrogen, so your leaves or easy breakdown material. And in my case, it's beet molasses is the source of nitrogen and a source of sugar for the bacteria. It's trying to get all of that happy where you're adding enough of those sugars, but you have enough woody material to create that magic meld. I don't know how some people naturally just have luck with the mycorrhizae and stuff. It seems like particularly with their outdoor material. I've had it, but I've never been able to key on exactly what makes it thrive in a bonsai container.
In past sort of employment, I've dealt with kind of the microbiome, the rhizosphere of plants, and we found that in a very nutrient poor environment, the plant kind of makes that conscious decision to associate with some sort of beneficial microbe. And so sometimes I think that if we add supplemental nutrients in the form of fertilizer, the plant doesn't feel the necessity or the need to make that association.
That's
So
very true.
Fire kind of depriving the plant
Right.
of that extra nutrient in order to make that really kind of bubble up.
Which is fairly true. Synthetic fertilizers won't kill the microbiota, but they're not encouraging the relationship, right? Which is very true, and which is at the heart of why I'm trying to use rock phosphate. I'm struggling. So are the plants. Like, I'll watch a nitrogen deficiency, and I'm like, how long will I let it go? How long will I let it go? Like, okay, that's how long I'll let it go. I haven't had a phosphorus deficiency yet. If I can make that happen, maybe I'll get that relationship going. But I also do think, like, I hope, really I want to drive that when my plants are outdoors and those different bacteria and fungi are floating through the air, right? They're kind of in an isolated room right now. Chances of them being exposed to the right thing could be slim to none. So you are correct. How you have a healthy tree and still encourage that, I haven't been able to figure out. Anything else, guys? Go for it.
So if you had to redo your basement grow setup, how would you solve that problem with the basement just being colder? Would you use like a propagation pad?
Yes, so I'll give you my current setup, which I must not have pointed out the picture. I put up, it's called Panda Film. Again, borrowed this from the marijuana growers. It's what they use to set up their grow tent, but basically it comes in a 10-foot by 100-foot sheet. One side's black, one side's white, and it's 5 mil plastic, and you can section off whatever piece of room you want. For me, 2 benefits there. One, I'm not telling all my neighbors with pink light, hey, that's the guy. I'm also building a kind of a controlled space. In our past home, my wife had her office set up in the basement, which was cold. So I had the ingenious idea, like, well, do they make rug heaters? And they do. So I got her these mats that are made to heat rugs on the floor. They worked great for her. Now we've moved, she doesn't need them. I put them in my grow room, and it's working to keep the temp up. I will say the electric bill has gone up some. I hope this year to be implementing ebb and flow tables to automate my indoor system even more. At which point I'm going to put heated propagation mats under the table to just heat the soil of the trees. So that's coming in the future. Rug heaters are an alternative, but somewhat pricey one. David.
Yeah, that works. I put heat mats under my reservoir tank for my hydroponics, and I can keep the water in my basement. It stays about 65 degrees. I can keep the water in the hydroponics above 70 degrees.
Nice. Nice.
So it will work.
Perfect. And that is, I don't know if
The electrical bill.
right. That's, my wife had a conversation with her sister about water bills, and she said, well, ours was, I said, honey, you're married to a horticulturalist. Like, that's always going to be the case. Shoot, what is the heating? So Welby Gardens. Welby Gardens is in a new location now. They're one of the largest annual flower producers in the area. Their old greenhouse, which was up North Denver, they used infrared heating. So when you walked in the greenhouse, it feels cold, but they're heating just the plants. And when you stood under one of those heaters, suddenly you'd feel yourself heat up. But it was a kind of an ingenious idea. They're able to keep their greenhouses cooler, saving them money. The soil stays nice and warm, and they actually produce healthier, more compact plants because the plant stays cool while the soil is warm. It's exactly what we're looking for, right? So just heat that soil, let the canopy stay a little cooler with your new fancy LED light. You'll produce the better growth, which I didn't key in on that. There. That LED is now on a light mover. So it goes back and forth on that bench. You're not necessarily stretching the footprint, but you can change the shape of the footprint is kind of what the manufacturer will say. What I will say is we don't need nearly as many photons hitting our plants, / if you put that in one spot, you're probably going to get bleached leaves. By moving it, you avoid that. Additionally, you get rid of, or you tame apical dominance. So under fluorescent lights in particular, the canopy of my tree is always super happy and growing like crazy. And the lower branches are, if I'm lucky, they just sit there all winter. If I'm unlucky, I might lose a lower branch or two. With that, basically you get a sunset and sunrise every minute and a half as this light moves back and forth. So every portion of the canopy is now getting light as it would if the sun were traveling across the sky, but in the course of a minute and a half, not a full day. It does reduce apical dominance, keeps your lower branches stronger, and you get better light penetration into the canopy. So if you have young branches in there that you're still trying to encourage, it keeps them going. I will say, like, absolutely have been thrilled with it. I want to eventually transfer a lot of those other fluorescent lights to the moving LEDs because I've been so happy with the way it's been working for me.
Why a minute and a half and not all day?
It's those timers come preset. The only adjustment you can make is how long it pauses at each end. So it's on its own little thing that moves across. I think I saw another question.
I was just wondering about so currently you have it set to be sort of a straight horizontal movement.
Yeah.
Would you consider any benefit from creating an arc as though the sun would move across the sky as an arc, or is that something too nitpicky? Or
Probably so. It sounds like the kind of thing I'd love to think about and try and rig up. The engineering might get difficult. Honestly, like, I try and extend past the plant, figuring I'm getting some of those angles. Could there be? Yes. I will say with fluorescent lighting, an idea to get rid of the apical dominance, most fluorescent fixtures now can be mounted sideways too. So mount a panel on your back wall and a panel above. Now you rotate your trees and they're going to get light all around if you're using fluorescence. Honestly, with the LEDs, I think having it move past is enough, past the plant. And then if I do add more LEDs, because the distance from your canopy is greater, that light is spreading out into the room quite a bit more. You reach a point, if you design your room properly, where you're getting equal light readings across the room because this light's bleeding into that light and so forth and so on.
What do you think about keeping the light stationary and creating a big turntable?
I have thought of that. So I haven't done it, but for me, the experiment wanted to be roots follow gravity and they grow down. But if you put a tree dead center on a spinning point, enough force to overcome gravity, your roots would grow out, right? And you'd get a nice Nabarian flare. I have no idea how that would work with your lighting, but it could be a fun project to do someday. All right. Happy to answer more questions if you guys have them, but hope you guys enjoyed geeking out on a little bit of what I've been doing, and